Can I eat the ones that fall on the ground? The homeless boy asked the popcorn vendor. Frank Miller pushed his popcorn cart through the central square of Portland as he had done for 15 years. His calloused hands gripped the handles of the red equipment tightly. It had become his only source of income after losing his factory job. That's when he felt a small presence beside him. Looking down, he saw a thin boy of about 10, dressed in dirty, torn clothes, gazing timidly at the golden popcorn in the cart. "Can I eat the ones that fall on the ground?" the child asked in a shaky voice, pointing to a few scattered kernels on the pavement. Frank froze. Those words echoed in his mind like a distant memory from 3 decades ago. They were the exact words he had spoken when he was that boy's age, in a similar square, to a vendor he would never forget. His hands trembled as he studied the boy. There was something familiar about that dirty face, especially a small scar on the chin that made his heart race. It was identical to the one his son Brian had as a child. "What's your name?" Frank asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Ethan, sir. Ethan Miller." The last name hit Frank like a punch to the gut. Miller was common, but combined with that scar and the boy's age, it couldn't be a coincidence. Without a word, he filled a large bag with fresh popcorn and handed it to the boy. "Thank you, sir," Ethan said, clutching the bag as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. Frank watched the boy eat hungrily, each movement stirring painful memories. He remembered abandoning his family 20 years ago, when the shame of failing to support his wife and teenage son became unbearable. Brian had been 15 at the time, and Frank had never seen him again. An elderly woman approached, calling for the boy. She was thin, with graying hair tied in a simple bun, dressed in humble but clean clothes. "Ethan, where have you been?" she asked affectionately, though concern laced her voice. "Mrs. Martha, the man gave me popcorn," the boy replied, holding up the bag. The woman looked at Frank with gratitude. "Thank you so much for your kindness. We don't have much, but—" "No need to pay," Frank interrupted. "Every child deserves to eat well." "I'm Martha Johnson. I take care of children who have no family. Ethan has been with me for 7 years. 7 years. Frank did the math quickly. Ethan would have been about 3 when he came to Martha. Exactly the age his grandson would be if Brian had had a child. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, back to the story. "How did he come to you?" Frank asked, trying to sound casual. Martha hesitated for a moment, watching Ethan as he continued eating. "He was left on the doorstep of our little house on a cold night. He was hurt and scared, with just a note giving his name. We never found out who his parents were." Frank felt the world spin. He needed to know more, but couldn't raise suspicions. Over the next few days, he returned to the square at the same time, always saving fresh popcorn for Ethan. The boy brightened whenever he saw him, and soon they fell into a routine of conversation. "Mr. Ethan, do you have family?" the boy asked one Thursday afternoon. "I had a son, but it's been a long time since I've seen him," Frank replied, his chest tightening. "I don't have a mom or dad either, but Mrs. Martha says family isn't just blood, it's who takes care of you." Frank nodded, but inside his heart was in turmoil. With every conversation, more details emerged. Ethan shared that he sometimes had nightmares about a woman crying and screaming a name he couldn't understand. He also mentioned that in the note that came with him, there was another name written. But Mrs. Martha kept the paper and never wanted to show it. For 2 weeks, Frank investigated quietly. He searched for old neighbors from the area where he used to live with his family. Mrs. Dorothy, who still lived on the same street, was the one who confirmed his suspicions. "Frank, it's been so long," she exclaimed when she saw him at her doorstep. "Your son Brian came here looking for you a few years ago. He was desperate. Why was he looking for me? His little grandson had gone missing. His daughter-in-law Jessica said, if you had been around, none of this would have happened. Brian blamed himself so much for not being able to find you to ask for help. Frank felt his legs go weak. Brian was a father, and his grandson had disappeared. The puzzle pieces were falling into place in a painful way. "Does Jessica still live here?" he asked, his voice choked. "No, they moved to Chicago after the child disappeared. Brian couldn't bear to stay here. He said every corner reminded him of his lost son. Frank returned home in a daze. In his small room at the back of a boarding house, he looked at himself in the mirror and saw his own mistakes reflected. He had abandoned his family out of pride, and now he realized his grandson might have been right in front of him, asking for popcorn that fell to the ground. The next morning, he decided to talk more deeply with Ethan. He found him at the park, playing with bottle caps, while waiting for Mrs. Martha to finish shopping at the market. "Ethan, do you remember anything from before you came to Mrs. Martha's house?" The boy stopped playing and grew thoughtful. "Sometimes I remember a man yelling a lot, and a woman crying and saying a name. Something like Frankie, or Frank." Frank's heart stopped. Frankie was what Brian used to call him as a child. Now he was certain Ethan was his grandson. "Ethan, I need to tell you something important," Frank began, but he was interrupted by Mrs. Martha's arrival. "Ready, Ethan. Let's go home," she said, but she noticed Frank's tense expression. "Did something happen?" "No, nothing. We were just talking," Frank replied quickly. But Martha wasn't convinced. In the days that followed, she began watching Frank with suspicion. She had cared for Ethan for 7 years, as if he were her own grandson, and now she felt something was threatening that bond. Frank, meanwhile, was torn between the joy of having found Ethan and the fear of disrupting the stability the boy had built. He decided he needed proof before revealing himself. Discreetly, he managed to get a few strands of Ethan's hair and took them to a lab for a kinship test. While waiting for the results, their bond grew deeper. Ethan shared his dreams of having a real family, a father to teach him to ride a bike, and a grandfather to tell him stories. Frank listened to every word like a stab to the heart, knowing he could have been all that if he hadn't abandoned Brian. "Mr. Ethan, if you could ask the world for one thing, what would it be?" Ethan asked one rainy afternoon as they took shelter under a nearby awning. "I'd ask to go back in time and be a better father," Frank answered honestly. "Why don't you look for your son?" "Because sometimes we hurt the people we love so much that they're better off without us." Ethan pondered this with the seriousness of a child who had learned pain too early. "But my heart, Mom, Mrs. Martha, always says forgiveness is the most powerful thing in the world, that it can heal any wound." 2 weeks later, the test results arrived, positive for a grandfather-grandson relationship. Frank cried alone in his room, clutching the paper with trembling hands. Ethan was indeed his grandson. Brian was the father, and he had missed the first years of the child's life because of his own cowardice. He decided he needed to find Brian before revealing himself to Ethan. Through old contacts, he discovered his son lived in a modest neighborhood in Chicago and worked as a mechanic. The problem was that Chicago was an hour's trip away, and Frank didn't have money for the fare. For a month, he saved every penny he could, eating just 1 meal a day. Ethan noticed Frank looked thinner and grew worried. "Mr. Ethan, are you sick?" he asked one morning when Frank seemed especially weak. "No, my boy, just a little tired." "Wait here," Ethan said, then ran off. He returned minutes later with Mrs. Martha, who carried a steaming lunchbox. "Frank, Ethan said you haven't been eating well. I brought you some food," Martha said, though her tone still carried suspicion. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Frank accepted the food gratefully, but Martha took the chance to confront him. "Frank, I need to know what your intentions are with Ethan. I can tell you have a special interest in him." "Mrs. Martha, I took care of this boy when he arrived hurt and traumatized. It took months for him to speak again. If you have any plan that could harm him, I'd rather you walk away now." Frank took a deep breath. It was time to share part of the truth. "Mrs. Martha, I believe Ethan might be my grandson." Martha stepped back, startled. What do you mean?" "My son's name is Brian Miller. He had a son who disappeared 7 years ago. Ethan is the right age, has the last name Miller, and has a scar just like my son's." Martha fell silent for a long moment, processing the information. "Do you have proof?" Frank showed her the DNA test results. Martha read it twice before sitting heavily on the park bench. My God, so the note was right. "What note?" "The one that came with Ethan. It said he was Brian Miller's son and that his mother couldn't take care of him. I kept it all these years, hoping someone would come looking. Frank felt tears welling up. Brian had been forced to abandon his own son. The pain his own abandonment had caused had multiplied into the next generation. "Where is your son now?" Martha asked. "In Chicago. I've been saving up to look for him." Martha grew thoughtful. She looked at Ethan playing carefree a few feet away. "Frank, this boy saved me. When my husband left, I was alone and without purpose. Ethan gave me a reason to live. If you really are his grandfather, I'll help you find his father. But it has to be done the right way. Ethan can't be hurt again." Frank agreed, moved by the generosity of the woman who had cared for his grandson when he needed it most. "Mrs. Martha, how can I ever thank you for everything you've done for him? By being the grandfather he deserves from now on," she replied firmly. Together they planned the trip to Chicago. Martha used her savings to help with the fare, and they agreed she would stay with Ethan while Frank went after Brian. The night before the trip, Ethan noticed the tension in the air. "Mrs. Martha, why do you both seem so strange?" he asked during dinner. "Well, Ethan, we might have some important news soon," Martha said, choosing her words carefully. "Good news or bad news? We hope it's very good, my dear." Frank left for Chicago on a Saturday morning. The address he had was for a mechanic's shop in South Side. During the bus ride, he mentally rehearsed what he would say to the son he hadn't seen in 20 years. The auto shop was small and busy. Frank asked for Brian Miller and was directed under an old car. He waited for the man to finish what he was doing and come out. When Brian stood up, holding a wrench with his face smeared in oil, father and son stared at each other in silence. Brian was a younger copy of Frank. The same eyes, the same way of tilting his head when focused, but there was a deep sadness in his gaze that Frank recognized all too well. "Dad?" Brian murmured, dropping the wrench to the ground. "Hi, son." The reunion was tense. Brian swung between anger and disbelief. Frank told him about Ethan, about the DNA test, about Mrs. Martha. Brian cried when he learned his son was alive and well cared for. "Dad, when Ethan disappeared, I looked for you desperately. I wanted your help. I wanted you to tell me everything would be okay. But you had vanished. Son, I was a coward. I left you when you were a teenager because I thought I was no good as a father. I didn't know you'd gotten married, that you'd had a son. Jessica never forgave me for not being able to protect Ethan. She said if I'd had a stable family, if you'd taught me how to be a man, none of this would have happened. Where is Jessica now? She remarried. She's pregnant. She managed to rebuild her life, but me, I could never get over losing Ethan." Frank hugged his son for the first time in 20 years. Both cried, releasing decades of pain and regret. "Son, Ethan is in Portland. He's doing well, healthy, studying. The woman who took care of him is an angel, but he needs to know who his father is." Brian hesitated. "Dad, what if he doesn't want to meet me? What if he's better off without me?" "Son, that's fear talking, the same fear that made me abandon you. Ethan dreams of having a family. He deserves the truth." Brian got time off work and they traveled together to Portland. Along the way, Frank told him about his conversations with Ethan, about his sweet, brave personality, how he took care of Mrs. Martha when she felt sad. "He seems to have gotten the best of both of us," Brian said, smiling for the first time. "And what Jess didn't pass down to him, life taught him. He has a natural empathy, a kindness that moves me every day." They arrived in Portland by late afternoon. Frank took Brian first to meet Mrs. Martha, who welcomed them into the small house where she had raised Ethan and 3 other children who had come into her care over the years. Martha studied Brian carefully. She saw in him the same traits she had grown to love in Ethan, but she also noticed the pain and regret he carried. "Brian, I want you to know Ethan is a special boy. He has a huge heart and an incredible capacity to forgive, but he's also suffered a lot. Whatever happened that brought him to my door left scars." "What happened was that I failed to protect him," Brian replied, his voice breaking. "That doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what you do from now on." Ethan came home from school just then, skipping and humming, carrying an old but well-kept backpack. When he saw Frank in the living room, he ran to greet him. "Mr. Frank, I'm so glad you came to visit." Then he noticed the unfamiliar man beside Frank. Brian stood frozen, staring at the son he hadn't seen since he was a baby. "Ethan, I want you to meet someone very special," Frank said gently. "This is Brian. He's your father." Ethan looked from Frank to Brian, trying to process the words. His joy turned to confusion, then something close to fear. "My dad? But I thought my dad didn't want me." Brian knelt to Ethan's height, tears in his eyes. "Ethan, I've always wanted you. Always. You were taken from me when you were very little. I spent all these years looking for you." The boy stepped back, hiding behind Mrs. Martha. "I don't remember you," he murmured. "You were too young when we were separated, son, but I remember you. I remember how you laughed when I tickled your belly. I remember your first word, which was Dada." Ethan stayed quiet, studying Brian's face. There was something familiar in those eyes, something that made his heart race without understanding why. Mrs. Martha stepped in wisely. "Ethan, how about you two take your time getting to know each other? Brian could visit us a few times before you decide anything." Brian agreed eagerly. "Ethan, I don't want to force you into anything. I just want the chance to know you and for you to know me too." Over the next few weeks, Brian visited Ethan every day after work. At first, they had short visits at Mrs. Martha's house, then walks around the square where Frank sold popcorn. Slowly, Ethan began to open up. "Brian, why did it take you so long to find me?" he asked one afternoon as they played ball in the backyard. Brian stopped the game and sat on the ground beside his son. "Ethan, when you were a baby, your mother and I were very young and didn't know how to properly take care of a child. We fought a lot, and it made you cry. One day, your mother said it would be better for you to stay with people who knew how to care for you the right way. She didn't want me. She loved you very much, Ethan, but sometimes people make wrong choices when they're scared and confused. I should have fought harder to keep you, but I was also young and afraid." Ethan absorbed the explanation with the seriousness that marked his thoughts. "And now, you're not scared anymore. Now I know that being a father isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and still doing what's right for your son." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. One day, while Ethan was at school, Frank, Brian, and Martha had a serious talk about the future. "Brian, do you want to take Ethan to Chicago?" Martha asked, trying to hide her anxiety. "Honestly, I don't know. Ethan is doing well here. He has you, school, friends. I don't want to uproot his life again." "But you're his father," Frank said. "He needs you." "Dad, I live in a small room at a boarding house. I work Monday through Saturday. How can I take proper care of him?" Martha thought for a moment. "What if we found a solution that works for everyone? Ethan could spend weekends with you in Chicago and stay here with me during the week. As you two get to know each other better, we can adjust." The idea seemed perfect for everyone. Ethan was excited about visiting Chicago, and Brian felt more at ease knowing his son would have Martha's stability during the week. The first weekend was an adventure. Brian took Ethan to see the auto shop, teaching him about cars and tools. Ethan showed a natural talent for understanding how things worked, a trait inherited from his father and grandfather. "Ethan, would you like to learn how to work on cars?" Brian asked as his son watched a car engine in fascination. "That'd be cool. Then I could fix Grandpa Frank's popcorn cart when it breaks." The ease with which Ethan already called Frank Grandpa moved both men. The family was rebuilding naturally, without forcing anything. During their second trip to Chicago, Ethan asked a question that caught Brian off guard. "Dad, why don't you get a girlfriend?" "Why do you ask that?" "It's just, Jack from my class said that moms and dads are happier when they have someone who loves them. And you seem sad sometimes." Brian sighed. How could he explain to a 10-year-old that he had built so many walls around his heart that he couldn't love anymore? "Ethan, sometimes when people go through really hard things, they forget how to be happy. But you're not going through hard things anymore. You found me, you found Grandpa Frank, you have a job. Ethan's childlike wisdom made Brian rethink his choices. Maybe it was time to try being happy again. A few weeks later, an unexpected situation tested their new family structure. Ethan came down with a high fever that wouldn't break. Martha called Brian in a panic, and he took the first bus to Portland. At the hospital, while waiting for test results, Ethan called out to both of them, "Dad, Grandpa Frank, you're not going to leave me again, right?" Brian held his son's hand, feeling the full weight of fatherhood. "Never again, Ethan. Never again." Frank added, "We're your family now, and family doesn't abandon family." Ethan recovered quickly, but the episode strengthened their bond even more. Brian decided it was time for permanent changes. He talked to his boss about working in Portland and ended up getting a job at a local repair shop. "Martha, could I rent a small room nearby?" he asked one afternoon. That way Ethan wouldn't have to keep switching cities on weekends. "Brian, you can stay here with us. We've had an empty room since Caitlin was adopted." Ethan would be over the moon. Martha's offer sealed their new family arrangement for good. Ethan would have his dad, Grandpa, and the woman who raised him all living close together. On the day Brian officially moved to Portland, Ethan threw a surprise party. He invited the other kids from Martha's house, some neighbors, and even the bakery owner where they bought bread. "Everyone, I want you to meet my family," Ethan announced proudly. "This is my dad, Brian, this is my grandpa, Frank, and this is my mom, Martha." Martha teared up at being called Mom. Brian and Frank exchanged knowing glances, sure they'd made all the right decisions, but life still had one more surprise in store. A few weeks after the move, Frank was selling popcorn in the square when a woman approached his cart. It was Jessica, Brian's ex-wife. "Excuse me, do you know a man named Brian Miller?" she asked timidly. Frank recognized her from the photos Brian kept. She was older with some gray hairs now, but it was her. "I do. Why are you looking for him?" "I was married to him. I heard by chance that our son Ethan was found. I came to... well, I don't really know why." Frank stayed silent, unsure if he should reveal he was Brian's father. "Jessica, is that you?" She startled. "How do you know my name?" "Because I'm Frank Miller, Brian's father." Jessica staggered and had to lean on the cart. You're his dad, but Brian said you had disappeared." "Yes, I abandoned my son 20 years ago, just like you abandoned Ethan." The coldness in Frank's voice made Jessica look down. "I know I have no right to be here, but when I heard Ethan was alive, I at least needed to see him." "Jessica, Ethan has a stable life now. He has a present father, a grandfather who loves him, and a woman who raised him with so much love. Why would you want to disrupt that?" "Because I'm his mother," Jessica burst out. "I spent 7 years suffering, thinking that something terrible had happened to him. And who left him on a doorstep when he was 3? Jessica started crying. "It was the worst mistake of my life. Brian and I fought so much that Ethan was always scared. I thought it would be temporary, that once we worked things out, we'd go get him. But Brian disappeared, and I didn't know where the child was." Frank felt his anger fade as he saw the genuine remorse in Jessica's expression. "You've rebuilt your life. You're married again, pregnant. Ethan doesn't need to relive the trauma of being abandoned. I just want to see him, from a distance, to know he's okay." Frank hesitated. That decision wasn't his alone. "I'll talk to Brian. If he agrees, you can see him. But Ethan can't know who you are unless Brian decides to tell him." Jessica agreed to any condition. The next day, Frank met her outside the school, hiding behind a car. When Ethan came out, laughing and jumping with his friends, Jessica broke down in tears. "He's so big, so handsome," she whispered. "He's a happy kid, Jessica. Gets good grades, loved by his teachers, helps take care of the younger kids at Mrs. Martha's place." "Martha?" "The woman who raised him. A saint, if you ask me. Gave up her own life to care for him and other abandoned children." Jessica watched Ethan chatting excitedly with Frank, who had come to pick him up. "Grandpa Frank, today my teacher said my essay was the best in class," Ethan shouted, running to hug his grandfather. "What did you write about?" "About how good it feels to have a family who truly loves me." Ethan's words struck Jessica like a knife. She saw the genuine happiness on her son's face and realized she had no right to disturb that peace. "Frank, thank you for letting me see him. He's better off without me," she said, preparing to leave. "Jessica, wait." Frank was torn. He could see the woman's sincere regret and knew Ethan was generous enough to forgive. "Do you want to talk to Brian?" Jessica hesitated. "He'd hate me for showing up now. Brian's learned a lot about forgiveness these past few months. I think you both deserve an honest conversation." The meeting was set for the next afternoon at Mrs. Martha's house. Brian was nervous when he heard Jessica was in town, but agreed to see her. When they met in Martha's simple living room, time seemed to stop. 7 years of separation, guilt and pain hung in the air between them. "Hi, Brian," Jessica said softly. "Hi, Jess." They talked for hours. Jessica spoke about her new marriage, how she'd tried to move on but could never forgive herself for leaving Ethan. Brian talked about the depression he'd faced, how he'd become a better man after reuniting with his son. "Brian, I wanted you to know I never stopped loving Ethan. It was desperation that made me leave him on that doorstep. Jess, I failed as a father back then too. We were too young and scared. Do you want me to leave and never come back?" Brian thought of Ethan's question about him having a girlfriend, of his son's wisdom about forgiveness and family. "I don't know, Jess. I don't know what's best for Ethan." Martha, who had been listening from the kitchen, joined them. "Can I give my opinion?" asked the woman who had raised Ethan. They both nodded. "Ethan is a child who loves easily and forgives quickly. His heart has room for many people. The question isn't whether you deserve his forgiveness, but whether you're ready to be better people from now on." Martha continued, "Jessica, you're pregnant and married. You have responsibilities to your new family. Brian is rebuilding his life as a father. Maybe you can be friends for Ethan's sake without complicating things." Martha's wisdom touched them both. Brian reached out to Jessica. "Jess, how about we start as friends? Ethan deserves to know his parents get along." Jessica shook his hand, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, Brian, for forgiving me and for becoming the father Ethan deserves." They decided together that Jessica would be introduced to Ethan gradually, first as a family friend. Ethan, with his characteristic ease, accepted her without many questions. "You have a baby in your belly," he exclaimed when he found out she was pregnant. "Yes, I do. It's going to be a girl." "That's so cool. When she's born, can I teach her how to make popcorn?" Jessica smiled with tears in her eyes. "Of course you can." A few weeks later, during a Sunday lunch at Mrs. Martha's house, Ethan asked an unexpected question. "Jessica, were you ever a mum before the baby in your belly?" The table fell completely silent. Frank, Brian, and Mrs. Martha exchanged glances, waiting to see how Jessica would respond. "Yes, Ethan. I had a boy a long time ago." "And where is he now?" Jessica took a deep breath and looked at Brian, who nodded slightly. "He's right here in front of me," she said softly. It took Ethan a few seconds to understand. When it finally clicked, his eyes widened. You're my real mom." "Yes, my love. I'm your birth mother." Ethan looked at Mrs. Martha, confused. "But Mrs. Martha is my mom." "Ethan," Mrs. Martha interjected, "you can have more than one mom. I'm your heart mom, and Jessica is your birth mom. Both of us can love you." Ethan pondered this with his usual seriousness. "So I have a dad, 2 grandpas, 2 mums, and a baby sister on the way." "That's right," Brian laughed. "Wow, I'm rich in family." Ethan's innocence broke the tension and everyone laughed. The boy who had started life asking for popcorn that fell on the ground now had a bigger family than he'd ever dreamed of. In the following months, the family dynamic adjusted naturally. Ethan spent most of his time with Brian and Mrs. Martha, visited Frank at the square every day to help with the popcorn cart, and saw Jessica on weekends when she traveled from Chicago to Portland. When Ethan's sister was born, he was the first to visit her in the hospital. "Dad, she's so tiny," he whispered, amazed. "You were just like that when you were born. Brian said, recalling the few memories he had of his son's early months. Can I hold her? Jessica, still weak from childbirth but radiant, placed her daughter in her older son's arms. Ethan, I want you to know that even when I wasn't there, you were always in my heart, she said, emotional. I know, Mom Jess. Mrs. Martha always said my birth mom loved me, even from far away. Ethan became the most protective big brother in the world. Every time he came to Chicago, he brought little gifts he made for his sister. Drawings, beaded bracelets, origami he learned at school. A year after the family reunion, Frank decided to throw a special party. It was Ethan's 10th birthday at Mrs. Martha's house, and he wanted to celebrate not just another year of life, but the rebuilding of their entire family. He organized everything at the square where it all began, near his popcorn cart. He invited neighbors, Ethan's school friends, other kids from Mrs. Martha's home, and even some regular popcorn customers. Ethan, before we sing happy birthday, I want to make a speech, Frank announced. The boy, now 11 and taller, smiled at his grandpa. A year and a half ago, a brave boy walked up to my cart and asked if he could eat the popcorn that fell on the ground. That boy changed my life forever. Frank looked at each family member. Ethan taught me it's never too late to start over, that love can heal old wounds, and that family isn't just about blood, it's also about choice. He turned to Mrs. Martha. Martha, thank you for taking care of our treasure when we couldn't. You're an angel on earth. For Brian, son, you've become the father I never knew how to be. Ethan is lucky to have you. For Jessica, thank you for having the courage to come back, and for understanding that sometimes love means accepting that others love too. And finally, for Ethan, and you, my grandson, thank you for teaching me that popcorn that falls on the ground can be the start of something beautiful. Ethan approached his grandfather with tears in his eyes. Grandpa Frank, can I make a speech too? Of course, my boy. Ethan climbed onto a chair so everyone could see him. Everyone. When I was little, I dreamed of having a family. Now I've learned that family isn't just who you're born with, but who chooses to stay together. He pointed to each one. Grandpa Frank taught me that hard work and kindness go hand in hand. My dad Brian taught me it's never too late to start over. Mom Martha taught me that love has no limits. Mom Jess taught me that forgiving is good for the one who forgives. Ethan smiled at everyone. And all of you taught me that I am deeply loved. Thank you for being my family. There wasn't a dry eye in the square. The boy who had once asked for scraps now had a feast of love around him. 2 years passed. Ethan, now 13, had grown into a responsible and caring teenager. He helped Frank with the popcorn cart during school breaks, assisted Martha with the younger kids, and was the most devoted big brother his little sister could ask for. Brian, inspired by the second chance life had given him, decided to study to become a mechanic teacher. He wanted to teach other young people a trade as a way to give back for all the blessings he'd received. Martha continued caring for children, but now with the support of an entire family. Frank helped with household expenses, Brian with repairs, and Jessica sent clothes and toys from Chicago. Jessica, in turn, named her daughter Martha Rose Miller, in honor of the woman who had cared for Ethan. The gesture moved Martha deeply and sealed the friendship between the two women for good. On a sunny afternoon, Ethan was helping Frank make popcorn when a small child approached the cart. It was a boy about 6 years old with dirty clothes and a hungry look. "Mister, can I eat the ones that fall on the ground?" the little boy asked in a shaky voice. Ethan and Frank exchanged emotional glances. History was repeating itself, but now they knew exactly what to do. Ethan filled a large bag with fresh popcorn and knelt to the boy's level. "What's your name?" "Jack." "Jack, do you have a place to stay?" The boy shook his head no. "Come with us. We know a really nice lady who takes care of kids like us." Frank smiled, watching his grandson act with the same generosity that defined their patched-together but love-filled family. That night, Jack slept at Martha's house, in the same room Ethan had occupied years before. Ethan insisted on being the one to tell the bedtime story, just as Martha had done for him. "Jack, do you know what family is?" Ethan asked. "The people who live in the same house?" "No. Family is the people who choose to love and care for each other, even when it's hard." Ethan tucked the younger boy's blanket in. "You'll see. Here, you'll learn just how loved you are." End of story. Now tell me, what did you think of this story of resilience and family love? Did Ethan's journey and his family move you? Leave in the comments if you believe forgiveness can truly rebuild families. I'd love to hear your honest thoughts about this beautiful tale. Thank you so much for staying with me till the end.